Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the 42nd meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I declare open agenda item 8, entitled Follow-up to an Implementation of the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action. We continue with the list of speakers, and the next speaker on the list is Sudan by video statement.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. مثل إعلان برنامج عمل فيينا واعتماده في العام 1993 علامة فارقة في طريق إعلاء حقوق الإنسان كأحد الركائز الأساسية التي تقوم عليها الحياة الكريمة.
Promoting human rights which are essential to a decent life as we all seek. We are happy to see that many of the declarations, many of the articles in the declaration are being implemented by the United Nations mechanisms, and there are reports being produced which help us to make progress towards implementation. Since the adoption of the declaration, the human rights situation has improved considerably over that we saw 20 years ago. The essential concepts of human rights have been brought to the awareness of governments and publics, but much remains to be done, as the pandemic has shown. As the preamble states, we must cooperate internationally in order that the objectives of the international community may be implemented. President Sudan takes the view that the Council must defend the progress made on human rights and raise awareness of these rights. Human rights are the basis of human dignity, which is a factor in development. The Council must uphold the principles of interdependence while ensuring that states' particularities are respected. Sudan is particularly committed to the implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to food, housing, and political rights, which are essential in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Malawi by Zoom. Malawi? It seems Malawi is not available, and the next speaker on the list is Cuba by video statement.
President, over a quarter century after the adoption of the Vienna Declaration Programme of Action, its commitments are far from being achieved. Xenophobia, racism, discrimination, and intolerance are perpetuated as part of the political agendas of certain states. In discussion of human rights topics, it is usual to see ideological bias, double standards, manipulation, politicization, selectivity, and the imposition of punitive mechanisms which continue to proliferate, while, paradoxically, the human rights system is in a difficult financial situation. Nevertheless, within this global crisis aggravated by the pandemic, eyes are closed to the most serious threat to the right to life and peace, and to the rise of unilateral coercive measures. Such is the case of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the USA against Cuba, which violates our people's human rights. The blockade has been extended to unprecedented levels during the administration of ex-President Trump, including in the context of the current pandemic. We denounce and reject this blockade. This policy of blockade against Cuba, including our country's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, must end, as the international community is calling for. We reject the manipulation of human rights as an instrument to put political pressure on countries and justify punitive actions, in many cases with the objective of promoting and legitimizing regime change. Cuba reaffirms the importance of continuing to work to promote dialogue, cooperation and mutual respect. These were central in the creation of this body and are the only possible way to achieve a better world for all. Thank you.
The next speaker on my list is Israel, on behalf of a group of countries, by video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of a cross-regional group of countries, including Argentina, Canada, Estonia, France, Greece, Kenya, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Republic of Korea, and my own country, Israel. A longer version of this statement will be available on the extranet. Sexual harassment happens all around us, and its prevalence is alarming. In addition to having a detrimental impact on victims and survivors, including on their physical and mental health or ability to remain and advance in the workplace, sexual harassment constitutes a major impediment to their full, equal, and effective participation in society, as well as in economic and political life. In recent years, the international community has witnessed an increased amount of reported cases of sexual harassment, including in Geneva-based organizations. While the actual number of incidents most likely is even greater than the reported one, it is encouraging to see that many organizations have carefully reconsidered their policies and interventions. Nonetheless, structural challenges remain and more should be done to tackle this issue also at the international level. In 2018, the Group of Friends to Eliminate Sexual Harassment was launched in New York by France, Kenya, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Israel as a platform to exchange good practices and raise awareness. We are proud to announce today the launch of the Geneva chapter, giving it a stronger cross-regional character, including countries from different regions as its founding members. The Geneva Group of Friends to Eliminate Sexual Harassment will present a platform for member states to address this issue in all its forms, including in the workplace, to regularly exchange views and work together to advance this matter, support the efforts to promote a cultural and operational change in the UN system as a whole, establish an ongoing dialogue and consultations with UN entities and other stakeholders to identify challenges and innovative solutions and share good practices, building on the UN model policy on sexual harassment and the UN system code of conduct to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment at the UN system events. The Group of Friends will aspire to propel this issue forward, including by liaising with the New York Group of Friends. We therefore invite other member states to join the group and look forward to working together with the UN towards the eradication of sexual harassment.
The next speaker on my list is the Russian Federation by video statement.
Thank you. Preventing ethnic cleansing in the Crimea is an increasing challenge in the context of rising nationalism in Ukraine. Over the recent years, Ukraine and Western countries, despite international obligations, have been conducting an inhuman policy of punishing the people of Crimea for keeping their language, culture, and traditions. The Western sponsors of Kiev are protecting the activities of Kiev, which is rolling out barbaric policies in many areas as a blockade against Crimea, preventing access to banking services, breaking off the family links of the many ethnic groups, preventing them from meeting their relatives, refusing them visas in violation of the right to free movement, helping Kiev with its minority within the General Assembly to bring untruthful resolutions against Crimea. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Bahrain by video statement.
السيدة الرئيسة، أود في البداية At the outset, I wish to express my country's full commitment and compliance with the international instruments with the institutional dimension of human rights system contained in the Vienna Declaration that seeks to stress the human rights, the importance of these rights. Madam President, the Vienna Declaration is a historic step in perpetuating the human rights system without any selectivity. It gives a framework for cooperation among all states, including the maintenance of human rights, and in cooperation with all international regional organizations. Accordingly, the Kingdom of Bahrain calls for finding the means for further cooperation among all states without any selectivity or politicization in accordance with the resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council. My delegation appeals to the international community to deal with human rights in full respect in accordance with its resolution, with the resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council, and in order to provide technical assistance and cooperation with the countries that ask for it. I thank you, Madam President.
We shall now proceed with the list of observer states of the Council. I now give the floor to Israel by video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. At the heart of the SDGs is the promise to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. In particular, SDG number 3 refers to enabling healthy aging, well-being, and access to health and care services. This goal clearly includes older persons who should be at the center of the health response. The COVID-19 pandemic has challenged all of us in this regard. Since the eruption of the pandemic, the government of Israel has been especially attentive to the congregated living institutions where older persons are particularly vulnerable. 112 such institutions are home to almost 5,000 persons, and a coordinated effort between the Ministry of Labor and Social Services, Ministry of Health, and the IDF Homefront Command assured they receive equipment of personal protection, disinfection supplies, and established quarantine zone. Moreover, a coordinated system of testing, sampling, and isolation was managed by the Protection and Fathers of Mothers project in the framework of COVID-19 Task Force, in order to assure the proper tracking and response to possible outbreaks in these institutions. Of course, there are many challenges ahead, including improving the coordination of different government offices. However, we are convinced of the importance of including the needs of older persons and their voices through the design, development, and implementation of any policy or measure. Thank you, Madam President.
I now give the floor to Sweden by video statement.
Madam President, all persons are entitled to the same human rights without discrimination. This should not be a controversial statement. Yet stigma, discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity persist. These patterns are worsened by the ongoing pandemic. To break this trend, states must explicitly address the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination affecting LGBTI persons and ensure their full and equal enjoyment of human rights. Measures to mitigate the pandemic must neither discriminate against LGBTI persons nor be used as a pretext to reduce democratic space. This includes the space for defenders of LGBTI persons' enjoyment of human rights and for organizations providing support for LGBTI persons. Any emergency measure must be necessary, proportionate, non-discriminatory, time-limited, and in accordance with obligations under international human rights law. LGBTI persons are often at heightened risk of being subjected to violence. Rather than being protected by the law, consensual same-gender relationships remain criminalized in almost 70 states. It is utterly unacceptable that some states continue to apply the death penalty for such relationship. Love is not a crime. Love is love. Thank you.
The next speaker on my list is Iran by Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. About 30 years ago, the global community unanimously reaffirmed its commitment to human rights through the adoption of the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action. VDPA became another milestone in united efforts to give human rights and fundamental freedoms their due place in today's world. In 1993, the aim of the VDPA was mainly to stress and reinforce the basic principles of universality, interrelatedness, interdependence, and indivisibility of the human rights, based on the non-selective and non-politicized approach. But the continuation of double standards, selectivity, and politicization of the human rights undermine our ability and commitment to respond effectively and implement the provisions of the VDPA. We have to regret over a number of serious setbacks in the promotion and protection of human rights, a number of basic human rights. Significant example of this setback is the right to development. The right to development is an inalienable human right by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. The right to development is gravely challenged as well as by various crises, including the North unilateral coercive measures, COVID-19 pandemic, wars, and other natural and human-made crises. The unilateral coercive measures have negatively affected almost all basic human rights, in particular the rights to health, to food, to education, to science, to free movement, and most and foremost the right to life in the United Nations. Thank you,
have
Mr. Vice
exceeded your
President.
speaking time. The next speaker is Algeria by video statement.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, the adoption of the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action reflects the international community's strong and loyal commitment to promoting and protecting human rights. This also highlights the international community's aspiration to fight all forms of discrimination, and that's why each state shoulders the responsibility of doing everything to eradicate this scourge. The Declaration rightly recognises that foreign occupation seriously hinders the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms, and it calls for the effective realisation of the inalienable right to self-determination. Hitherto, the people of the non-self-governing territory of Western Sahara have not been able to freely exercise their right to self-determination, to live peacefully in their own land. This situation has lasted for over 40 years, and urges the establishment of international mechanism to oversee the human rights situation in this illegally occupied territory. Furthermore, the pillaging of natural resources by multinationals is an additional crime and exacerbates the human rights violations. They must be called to answer for their insatiable plundering in courts, as it contravenes the principle of permanent sovereignty of peoples over their natural resources.
The next speaker on my list is Azerbaijan by Zoom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The full version of this statement will be on extranet. Azerbaijan sees the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action as an important document guiding our efforts to protect and promote human rights. Throughout the decades of occupation of 20% of its territories, Azerbaijan had been alarming the international community of gross violations of rights of Azerbaijani refugees and IDPs exposed to the ethnic cleansing. However, the last year's war has ended with the liberation of territories of Azerbaijan from occupation, thus enabling the restoration of rights of our displaced population. With the trilateral statement of November 2020, Azerbaijan restored its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The statement brought an end to the conflict, creating conditions for sustainable peace building. Azerbaijan is committed to the implementation of the document for the normalization of the interstate relations with Armenia and healing the wounds of the bloody conflict. At the same time, the massive contamination of the liberated territories of Azerbaijan with mines by Armenia in the occupation period and during its withdrawal strongly impedes the realization of rights of Azerbaijani IDPs. Armenia's refusal to hand over maps of minefields has already claimed the lives of more than 20 Azerbaijanis and left more than 70 wounded since the end of hostilities, and this continues to pose a serious threat to lives and safety of our population. In this regard, we call upon to Armenia to respect and to fully implement its international obligations for reaching sustainable peace and development in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic by Zoom. Is Syria available by Zoom? Okay.
نعم سيد نائب الرئيس.
Yes, Mr. Vice President. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Vienna Declaration Program of Action stressed the universality, interdependence, and indivisibility of human rights and the need to deal with them in a comprehensive, equitable, impartial, and equal manner. The Vienna Declaration emphasized the right of self-determination for peoples under occupation as a fundamental, inalienable right that guarantees the enjoyment of all other rights. With COVID-19 pandemic challenge, its consequences, and the relentless international efforts to combat the pandemic and mitigate its catastrophic effects, Syria stresses the importance for the Council to deal with all human rights far from selectivity and double standards, and to adopt a comprehensive and realistic approach that addresses the role of foreign occupation, the sanctions, the illegal economic unilateral coercive measures imposed by some countries, especially by the United States and the European Union, which undermine the efforts of the targeted countries to face the pandemic, intensify the blockade imposed on them, deny their basic rights, and hinder their efforts to achieve development in violation of human rights and international law. In line with the spirit of the Vienna Declaration, Syria stresses the importance of respecting the principles of the UN Charter in handling human rights issues. Thank you. Thank you.
Georgia remains committed to the promotion and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Equal rights of all persons are guaranteed at the constitutional level. We attach particular importance to the elimination of discrimination against women in all aspects of their life. Furthermore, women's economic empowerment and gender mainstreaming are among state policy priorities. The COVID-19 pandemic has increased the vulnerability of women to violence. To respond to this challenge at the national level, communication strategy on violence against women and domestic violence during the COVID-19 crisis has been developed and rigorously implemented. The strategy serves to provide information to the victims of domestic violence on alternate ways of reporting violence. Special attention needs to be paid to the rights of disabled persons. In this respect, in 2020, the Law on Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted in Georgia. Just recently, Georgia has ratified the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Regrettably, human rights situation in the Russia-occupied Abkhazia and Trin Valley regions of Georgia remains alarming. Against the backdrop of ethnic discrimination, violations of right to life, arbitrary detentions, wounding and kidnappings, infringement of the right to property, violations of right to health, restrictions on education in native language, the local population is deprived of minimal safeguard for their lives by the occupying power. The situation has become even more worrisome during the COVID-19 pandemic, while along with other violations, the residents of these regions are deprived even the possibility to get the elementary medical services that led to several fatal cases. I thank you.
Thank you. L'orateur suivant est la Tunisie.
The next speaker is Tunisia via video statement.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to reaffirm its commitment to the Vienna Declaration and to stress the interdependence and indivisibility of human rights. The COVID-19 crisis requires that the international community contemplate the best means in order to preserve the dynamism of this declaration despite the major challenges it is facing. In this respect, we stress the importance of adopting national and international policies based on solidarity, equality, and justice in all its aspects, political, civil, economic, cultural, and social, on equal footing and away from selectivity. The progress achieved in the human rights systems in the past 20 years should not distract from the shortcomings that prevent from the application of the Vienna Declaration principles. The interdependence between peace, development and human rights requires, as an international community, that we work further in order to find a peaceful political settlement to the conflicts taking place all over the world in order to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Hence, we stress the importance of technical assistance and capacity building. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the United States of America by Zoom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Today, the United States reaffirms its support for the principles of the Vienna Declaration. We emphasize its strong focus on human rights, and I quote, recognizing and affirming that all human rights derive from the dignity and worth inherent in the human person, and that the human person is the central subject of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and consequently should be the principal beneficiary and should participate actively in the realization of these rights and freedoms. The United States rejects efforts to subsume the primacy of the individual to the promotion of development and cooperation, as some would seek to do. The United States rejects efforts to shield nations responsible for committing human rights violations against their own people under the guise of sovereignty and non-interventionism. We support the Council's fundamental role in holding those who believe themselves above scrutiny to account. In the United States, we strive to create an ever more perfect union for every American, realizing we still fall short. Through this process, we have repeatedly expanded the rights and freedoms of every individual in the United States and have emerged stronger, more determined, and better equipped to support efforts to defend human rights and fundamental freedoms globally, because we have fought for them at home ourselves. Our unshakable resolve to continue these efforts is strengthened by our recent experiences. We look forward to working with all human rights defenders to protect, defend, and advance the rights of all individuals.
I thank you, sir. May I ask you to conclude your statement, since you have exceeded your speaking time? Thank you. I now give the floor to Australia by video statement.
Madam President, Australia reaffirms the significance and relevance of the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action. In particular, we reaffirm our unwavering support for Article 1, which is a clear and unequivocal expression of the commitment of all states to fulfil their obligations to promote universal respect for and observance and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, the importance of international cooperation in the field of human rights, and the primary responsibility of governments to protect and promote human rights. Regrettably, over the course of this session of the Council, we have seen repeated attempts by some states to avoid these commitments. States have attempted to use the veil of sovereignty or non-interference to shield themselves from international view. Australia will not ignore human rights violations, and neither should this Council, its members or observers. The Council is mandated to address these situations, including through scrutiny and accountability. We applaud the large number of states who, despite their own domestic challenges, remain committed to the principles of the VDPA and to meeting their international obligations, and who engage openly with the Council and its mechanisms. We urge others to follow their lead. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I understand that Malawi is available, and I give the floor to Malawi by Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. President. The importance of Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action, which was adopted in 1993, remains crucial in the face of global challenges threatening human rights today. Crucially, the declaration calls for enhanced multilateral system to promote enjoyment of human rights for all people, including those from developing countries. Mr. President, Malawi recalls the declaration recognition on the role of international cooperation towards the realization of the right to development and the elimination of obstacles to development. The panel discussion on the role of poverty alleviation in promoting and protecting human rights highlighted the type of barriers facing developing countries in their efforts to eradicate poverty. The fact that the goal number 1 of Sustainable Development Goals will not be met by 2030 should be a concern for the Council. The debt burden on developing countries has been exacerbated by the impact of COVID-19, which has not only affected debt repayment, but also increased the rate of borrowing. Malawi continues to call for debt relief measures, including debt cancellation by other member states and the donors. The only way of avoiding leaving developing countries further behind is an act now, as COVID might be around for foreseeable future and directly affects the socio-economic development. Mr. President, the COVAX initiative is a good example of solidarity needed in advocating for universal enjoyment of human rights and freedom. We commend all stakeholders under this initiative. At the same time, we caution the vaccine nationalism which will continue undoing the gains achieved in pursuit of the SDGs. Any delay in the access of the vaccine for developing countries will translate into delays in rebuilding their economies. Mr. President, Malawi continues to make strides as the enjoyment of political rights and civil liberties for her citizens is concerned. I would give an example. In 2020, demonstrated the independence and integrity of the judicial system in our country in upholding the tenet of the constitutional democracy. As democracy, we respect the will of the people. In conclusion, Mr. President, Malawi encourages the Human Rights Council and member states to recognize the Vienna Declaration in order to protect the rights of the vulnerable people, thereby promoting the universal value of the human rights and the fundamental rights. I thank you.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker on the list of delegations wishing to take the floor. And we shall now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. The first on the list is the Action Canada for Population and Development.
Action Canada makes this statement on behalf of Sexual Rights Initiative, Asia Pacific, and Center for Reproductive Rights. In the Vienna Declaration, states agreed to encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. For over a year, civil society organizations have repeatedly called on states to use a rights-based approach to the pandemic. We've drawn attention to states' use of pandemic to roll back on rights, obligations, and commitments and institute harsh policies and penalties against human rights defenders, dissidents, and opposition parties. State responses to the pandemic have fed on and deepened existing racialized, class, and gender inequalities within and between states. We've witnessed obscene displays of vaccine nationalism, so-called vaccine diplomacy, defense of intellectual property regimes, laying bare the collusion between rich states and pharma companies. Their total disregard for 90% of the world's population forced to the back of the queue. We dispute that barriers resulting from intellectual property regimes are not a human rights issue. Apparently, human rights are universal, indivisible, and inalienable, except when it comes to big pharma's life-saving drugs, medicines, and technology. Then they are to be bargained away because profits take precedence over lives. HRC needs to decide whose side it is on, the side of the people or the side of pharma profits. The people are watching.
The next speaker is China Soong Ching Kling Foundation.
Distinguished President, it's a great honor to take the floor on behalf of China Soong Ching Ling Foundation, which is a prestigious public welfare organization in China. Elimination poverty is recognized as one of human rights actions by Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and also as the primary goal by 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. China has taken development as a means of eradicating poverty, paying special attention on preventing intergenerational transfer of poverty by education. In the past 8 years, Chinese government has made comprehensive poverty alleviation actions on increasing investment and training teachers in rural areas, financing poor children to receive compulsory education to make sure no kids in poverty family drop out of schools. The special recruitment program for higher education has supported 700,000 rural students to enter into prestigious universities. We call for international community to respond Council's resolution on extreme poverty and human rights adopted in 2011 that asks states to remain elimination poverty as a high priority. Government should make out workable national strategies on poverty reduction, carry out comprehensive and coherent policies, adhere to non-discrimination principle to make sure the public resources can be fairly accessible to poor people, especially allocating affordable education and health care resources to women, children, and disabled people in poverty.
I now give the floor to the Next Century Foundation.
Madam President, the Next Century Foundation is concerned by the discontent being expressed with the current political system in the Lebanese Republic. The Lebanese have a right to self-determination of government as outlined in the Vienna Declaration on Human Rights. Most citizens of the Lebanese Republic believe comprehensive reform is necessary to alleviate the crises that have been created by the current political system. We stress the urgent need to implement a system of bicameral governance as outlined in the Taif Agreement of 1989, which includes an elected confessional upper house using current electoral guidelines, and a lower house elected on a non-confessional basis using a single national constituency, following the electoral principles of proportional representation. The lower house should retain complete control over legislation, with the upper house confined to initiating legislation on crucial issues and exercising a casting vote on exceptional occasions, such where a deadlock exists in the judiciary or lower house. It is essential the upper house contains representation from each of the 19 constitutionally recognised confessions and endeavours to proportionally represent each confession as best possible. We further call for the removal of the requirement that executive positions of governance be held by specific confessional groups, recognising the historic purpose of this arrangement has expired. It is also imperative that progress towards establishing an independent and transparent judiciary occurs as a vital step in strengthening political and financial accountability. Implementing these changes immediately is critical for progress in the Lebanese Republic. Thank you.
The next speaker is Federation for Women and Family Planning.
I make this statement on behalf of 10 organizations. In the Vienna Declaration, states committed to the real and effective participation of the people in decision-making processes. Today, we ask the Human Rights Council, are you ensuring people's full participation in your decision-making? How can states be accountable for their commitments and positions if they restrict civil society scrutiny over negotiations, if webcast archives are only available in English, and if most HRC discussions lack accessibility measures? Efficiency, rationalization, and resource constraints are not acceptable justifications. Despite important advances regarding video statements, which should continue after the pandemic, persons from the Global South and persons with disabilities are disproportionately affected by the move to online proceedings. We demand accountability for the continued erosion of civil society space, including the removal of public access details for online informal negotiations, which limits access and favors those in Geneva, the renewal of efficiency measures and removal of general debates in June despite their impact on participation, the capping of general debate statements this session, in addition to pre-existing barriers such as ECOSOC status requirements, reprisals, the cost of getting to Geneva, travel restrictions, and discriminatory visa regulations. Civil society participation is core to the Council and to any human rights-based approach. It must be prioritized in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, the HRC efficiency process, and the UN budget crisis. Nothing about us without us.
I now give the floor to the Chinese Association for International Understanding.
Dear Chairman, I'm Zhang Xianan from Chinese Association for International Understanding. China has always paid special attention to human rights protection in its counterterrorism effort, preventing any violation of human rights caused by counter-terrorist measures. We noticed that there has been growing international concern about the so-called forced labor. Last year, my association interviewed some Uyghur people from Xinjiang and now work in Fujian and Hubei province. They sign contracts with their employers on the basis of equality and get due payment. They make more money there, and their family quickly shake off poverty. What's more, the living condition is comfortable and the halal food is delicious. It's also convenient to go shopping and have video chat with their family in their spare time. And they are able to attend religious activities at mosques nearby. Many of them have grown into master hand and even managers. They are satisfied with their current life and want to settle down. I think it is a good example to show that the so-called forced labor is absolutely nonsense.
The next speaker is asociacionhafteuir.org.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Vice President. The Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action reiterates the universality of human rights and again recognises that all individuals have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, expression and religion. Regrettably, many states, pressure groups or even private companies providing goods and services disregard the universality of human rights and only defend selective principles as they muzzle, silence and curtail the freedoms of all those who don't share their thoughts. Censorship by major technological companies such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, Amazon cannot be tolerated. Hundreds of motivated citizens have denounced this. They discriminate, censure, curtail and circumscribe the freedom of expression, and those who don't promote their LGBTI and pro-abortion agendas. Their excuses that they're private companies, as if international law wasn't anything to do with them. Within the freedom of opinion, expression, conscience and religion, and in accordance with Vienna and other international legislation, we want to be able to freely express ourselves, want to be able to support policies to promote childbirth and denounce the bloody business of abortion, the promotion of abortion at home during the coronavirus, and denounce the abortion of babies with disabilities. Thank you.
The next speaker is International Humanist and Ethical Union.
Thank you, Madam President. The Vienna Declaration emphasizes the responsibilities of all states to respect human rights for all without distinction. Yet nearly 28 years later, 42 countries have legal barriers to freedom of association and expression around sexual and gender diversity issues. These barriers take a variety of forms, including censorship, language around propaganda, prosecution of LGBTI symbols, and the criminalization of offenses against morality and religion. For instance, in Turkey, 4 students were arrested in January over a piece of artwork that reportedly combined LGBTI symbols with an image of an Islamic site. The Interior Minister described them as perverts. In Tunisia, security forces reportedly target LGBTI activists at protests with arbitrary arrests, physical and verbal assaults, and refusing legal counsel. This month, a prominent LGBTI rights activist was sentenced to 6 months in prison for shouting outside a police station after officers refused to register her harassment complaint. In Ghana, lawmakers are currently looking to pass a bill criminalizing all forms of advocacy on LGBTI issues. LGBT Rights Ghana, a non-profit human rights organization operating a community center in Accra, was forced to close its doors after conservative and religious opponents claimed it ran counter to family values. The right to free expression and free association belongs to all without distinction. We call on the aforementioned countries to recognize this and to cease their persecution of LGBTI rights activists. I make the statement in memory of David Polflier, who was murdered in a homophobic hate crime in Belgium earlier this month. I thank you.
I now give the floor to Al Salam Foundation.
Madam President, according to the Vienna Declaration and the Programme of Action, all peoples have the right to self-determination, and denying this right is a serious human rights violation. We would like to express our concern for Bahrain's Al Khalifa dictatorship, which systematically denies Bahraini citizens their right to political self-determination. Since February 2011, the unelected Bahraini government has arrested leaders of the political opposition and human rights defenders who called and advocated for self-determination. The executive has designed and passed vague counter-terrorism law that target the political opponents of the government and use this law to effectively crush the movement for self-determination in Bahrain. Mr. Hassan Mushaima, Mr. Abdullah Wahab Hussain, and Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singace are political leaders and human rights defenders who were sentenced to life imprisonment for leading and advocating for the right to self-determination of the Bahraini people. We are deeply concerned about the prison condition for these individuals, especially the denial of essential medical care provided to those involved in the self-determination movement. This medical care is denied by the Al Khalifa government in retaliation for their activism. Despite Bahrain's atrocious human rights record, Bahrain is a member of this council. We call on the Council to adopt human rights standards as part of its membership criteria, so that countries with as appalling records as Bahrain are deemed ineligible for membership until they implement lasting change. Thank you.
The next speaker is Zero Pauvre A.
السيد الرئيس يؤكد إعلان برنامج عمل فيينا على الاهتمام.
Thank you. The Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action emphasized the importance of children's rights while they are daily being killed in many areas. Acute malnutrition among children and women in Yemen have been on the increase since the Houthis destroyed the infrastructure. There are diseases such as diarrhea, respiratory disease, and others, and food insecurity. United Nations agencies have found Yemen to be one of the most dangerous places for children. There are transmissible diseases. The Houthis have created this crisis, targeting civilians with collective punishment. Humanitarian assistance ends up on the black market. President, we have seen the images, and this is a scandal. We call on all states and organizations working in Yemen to ensure that humanitarian assistance and food assistance can reach beneficiaries directly in order also to re-establish the state apparatus in order to overcome this crisis. Thank you.
The next speaker is European Center for Law and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. President. Religious persecution is one of the most egregious attacks against human rights, and Christianity remains the most persecuted religion in the world. The number 10 offender of countries targeting the Christian faith and those who follow Jesus is India. This ranking of India in the top 10 is primarily a consequence of growing Hindu nationalism, which has resulted in a significant increase in the persecution of Christians in India. Clearly, through the denial of official COVID-19 aid and the blind eye that officials often turn to religiously motivated violence against Christians, the government in India is complicit in and even the perpetrator of religiously motivated discrimination. This claim can further be supported by the recent wrongful targeting, arrest, and detention for over 7 months of our client, Pastor Brian Nairn. During this time, one customs official made it quite clear that Pastor Nairn was targeted because of his Christian faith, stating that they had been ordered by the central government to crush Christianity, and they were going to do just that. It was only after months of concerted diplomatic efforts that justice was finally able to prevail and Pastor Nairn allowed to return home. Pastor Nairn was lucky, but we cannot forget the remaining Christians in India and all over the world who are facing persecution daily simply because of their faith. We encourage this body to denounce religious persecution and to instead make it a priority to protect the right to practice one's faith freely. Thank you.
The next speaker is Conectas Direitos Humanos.
Conectas Direitos Humanos, Instituto Igarapé, and Instituto Sou da Paz would like to call this Council attention to setbacks in firearms and ammunition control regulation in Brazil. Despite high rates of armed violence, the Brazilian government expanded access to weapons and ammunition and reduced the state capacity to control this arsenal. In the last 2 years, there has already been a 65% increase in the number of newly registered weapons. Last year, 43,000 people were killed in Brazil, 70% of them with the use of firearms. This policy accentuates the impacts of racism once black people are 3/4 of homicide victims. It also neglects the importance of controlling arms and ammunition to reduce violence against women and other forms of victimization. This is a wide-ranging deregulation that affects not only Brazilian security and democratic stability, but can also be a threat to other countries that will be impacted by flows of arms and ammunition trafficking. We call on this Council attention to closely monitor human rights violations in Brazil. We also call on the Brazilian judiciary and Congress to react quickly to prevent these setbacks. We demand from the federal government to cease this deregulation and implement public security policies that respect life, tackle racism, and ensure fundamental rights and guarantees for its population as a priority. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the Institute for NGO Research.
The Vienna Declaration repeatedly emphasizes the importance of protecting the right to health. We are disturbed to see, therefore, the gross neglect of this right in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead of learning from the successes of Israel's vaccine program, available to all citizens and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many governments and NGOs funded by those governments have launched a vaccine libel campaign against Israel to divert from their own failures to adequately plan for and protect their populations. A higher percentage of Palestinians have been vaccinated by Israel, even though they are not required to do so by international law, than many European countries have of their own populations. These actors also have remained silent while the Palestinian Authority has deliberately tried to block Israeli efforts to increase the numbers of vaccines available to Palestinians. In addition, since the pandemic began just over a year ago, few to none of the major human rights NGOs and their government sponsors have undertaken any in-depth investigations or spoken out about the role of China in starting this pandemic and the efforts of the Chinese government to cover it up. The COVID-19 pandemic has destroyed the lives of billions of people across the globe, and yet this Council is also silent. It is time for the Council to appoint a special rapporteur and also conduct a commission of inquiry to hold those responsible for this unprecedented violation of human rights.
The next speaker is Association Internationale pour l'Égalité des Femmes.
Thank you, Chair. The Vienna Declaration undoubtedly raised many hopes for the improvement of the human rights situation in the world. Article 60 of the Declaration is key, stating that states should abrogate legislation leading to impunity for those responsible for grave human rights violations, such as torture, and prosecute such violation, thereby providing a firm basis for the rule of law. This article protects the rights of victims of torture, family of those who lost their loved one, and can prevent recurrence of this human rights violation. A statement made by the 7th UN report on September 3rd, in connection with those executed in Iran in the summer of 1988, relates precisely to this article in the Declaration. While supporting the statement of the 7th UN report, we call on the Human Rights Council and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michael Bachelet, to listen to its own UN special mechanism and to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate the crimes of persons with immunity in Iran. Thanks.
The next speaker is Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd.
States that trafficking is incompatible with the dignity and worth of the human person and must be eliminated. Human trafficking is one of the fastest growing criminal industries in the world. Tens of millions of people are trapped in forced labor and or trafficked into sexual exploitation. For this reason, human trafficking is often recognized as modern-day slavery. A consensus is growing among many states that the most effective way to confront this social evil is by addressing the root causes of human trafficking. These root causes include demand, poverty, lack of education and healthcare, food insecurity, unemployment, especially youth, gender inequality, supply chain abuse, insufficient social protection with a lack of punishment of perpetrators, racism and violence against women and girls. To address these root causes, we need legislation that ensures sufficient income for a person to support themselves and their families, and end to the gender wage gap, ensures transparency in the supply chain, and acts compassionate immigration laws and ends racism. In sex trafficking, we need to ensure that we do not punish the victims, but rather criminalize the sex buyers and those who profit from the prostitution industry. Also, we must guard those who are most at risk, such as runaway youth, foster children who are not longer eligible for benefits, and LGBTQ youth. Human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. Rather, it flourishes when society no longer recognizes the infinite value of each person and nature, which is resources, but it's seen simply as a commodity. Thank you for your efforts to create a world where human trafficking, both labor and sex, no longer exists.
I now give the floor to the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities.
Madam Chair, the use of pellet guns that maim, blind, and kill protesters and bystanders in Indian-occupied Kashmir violates international law. IRM commends India for cleaning the toxic waste dumped into the Siachen glaciers, but calls for monitoring by the OHCHR to assess damage to water supplies in Kashmir. Pakistan and India and states must address the right of self-determination in Jammu and Kashmir. The Hawaiian Kingdom, a constitutional monarchy, and the independent tribes inhabiting an independent territory in Alaska are under foreign occupation. We diplomatically protest the annexation of Alaska and Hawaii, annexed through General Assembly Resolution 1469 of 1959, and call for its annulment. Since it is a violation of our international allodial title and dominion over our territory and resources, it is an international act of apartheid and a crime against humanity. States, multinational corporations, and developers are placed on notice that purchasing territory from occupation authorities and puppets and not from free political institutions of peoples under foreign occupation is invalid. For example, the Donlin Mine and the Pebble Mine in Alaska, and the purchase of large tracts of land in Hawaii by occupation foreign forces to foreign usurper entities are unlawful. I thank you, Madam Chair.
The next speaker is Synergie Féminine pour la paix et le développement durable.
السيد الرئيس المجلس الموقر إننا وإن نثمن ما ورد في إعلام.
Thank you. We note the call for eliminating violence against women in the declaration and call attention to the situation of women in the Houthi jails, tortured, detained. I and other women had no support in that situation. There are thousands of women being detained in the Houthi jails. Some of them have been raped. There are also dozens of children being held there. The Security Council Sanctions Committee looked at this question and placed sanctions on certain persons accused of crimes. We call for action to be taken so that the Houthi release women immediately and end all of the violations in Yemen. We call on this Council and the Office of the High Commissioner to give priority to the situation of female detainees in Houthi jails and for action to be taken against the perpetrators. Thank you.
Next on the list is International Action for Peace and Sustainable Development.
Mr. President, the World Health Organization officially declared the outbreak COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. Today, the world is dealing with crises of immense proportion. The pandemic has shown that this crisis is full of poverty, hunger, a weak health system, and lack of clean water and sanitation, education, and global cooperation. The global recession caused by COVID-19 is alarming and has made researchers question whether sustainable development goals are fit for the post-pandemic age. Some have even claimed that certain SDG targets might be counterproductive because they enhance growth rather than development. Secretary General of the United Nations called for all warring parties to lay down their weapons in support of battle against COVID-19, the common enemy that is threatening all humankind. However, most of the warring parties around the globe gave a deaf ear to the Secretary General's calls and kept their eyes closed while people were dying in helplessness. The situation is most alarming and disturbing. My organization is of the considered opinion that these crises of high magnitude, the SDGs, cannot be achieved unless the dispute pending on the United Nations agenda are addressed on war footing. I thank you, Mr.
The next speaker is the International Federation for the Protection of the Rights of Ethnic, Religious, Linguistic, and Other Minorities.
Madam President, throughout the world, people are dying from the COVID-19 pandemic and its devastating consequences. If the promises by global leaders to treat COVID-19 vaccines as a global public good are not fulfilled, and its equitable access and distribution ensured, the virus may continue to mutate and more people will be affected. We strongly believe that the Human Rights Council should act and speak out with clarity at this session on the failure of rich countries to provide equitable access to vaccines and to address the health and development crisis affecting many countries. It is time that the right to health of people is put before the profits of corporations. By lift patent rights on COVID-19 vaccines, their production could be greatly increased and many lives be saved. The ongoing obstruction by rich countries at the WTO to waivers of patent rights is in grave violation of the same country's legal obligations under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to ensure its implementation to the maximum of available resources. We ask the Council to adopt a resolution sending a strong message for the immediate lifting of patent rights on the emergency production of COVID-19 vaccines, which is called for by over 100 mostly low and middle income states, as well as the Director General of the WHO and increasingly by global public opinion.
Next is the Khiam Rehabilitation Center for Victims of Torture.
السيد الرئيس سيبقى إعلان فيينا العالمي نقطة
Thank you, Mr. President. The Vienna Declaration is still a turning point in favor of the human rights. We can see the human rights situation in Yemen, and at the time when there are demonstrations all over the place, and while there is a health crisis caused by the alliance forces, the Yemeni delegation hasn't condemned all these attempts, which amount to war crimes, and the statement made by Yemen doesn't represent the aspirations of the Yemeni people. In the Khiam Center, we underline our commitment to Vienna Declaration, and all reports by UN experts is a part of the war waged against the Yemenis. The international humanitarian law provides for the right to live in peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Speaker is the Global Institute for Water, Environment and Health.
Dear Mrs. President, GUE is deeply concerned by the ongoing deterioration of human rights in Bahrain and supporting the Foreign Affairs High Representative of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, who has pledged to use all possible means to continue improving human rights in Bahrain. The Bahraini government continues to systematically suppress the right of expression of human rights defenders, political opponents, activists, journalists, and civil society organizations. GUE calls on the Bahraini government to increase tolerance and listen to opponents who peacefully object the government's decision, limit the censorship power and other media oversight bodies, release all wrongfully imprisoned journalists, human rights defenders and social media activists, cease mass online filtering and reinstate arbitrarily blocked websites. GUE kindly urge the Human Rights Council to take this opportunity to hold its Bahrain counterparts accountable for their human rights commitments and advise the government to demonstrate tangible and permanent improvement to the human rights situation in the country. Thank you for your attention.
I now give the floor to the Commission africaine des promoteurs de la santé et des droits de l'homme.
Mr. President, the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action adopted by the World Conference on Human Rights states that violations of human rights of women in situations of armed conflicts are the violations of the fundamental principles of international human rights and humanitarian law. Today, Kashmiri women face both the military crackdown and the pandemic, but there is little help available for survivors of gender-based violence. A team which visited Kashmir from September 23rd to 28, 2020 has released an alarming report about the condition in the valley. They said they have heard the armed forces speaking derogatory about the Kashmiri women. The forces have threatened women, giving the examples of the mass rape of Kunan Pushpura in 1991. The women are living under a constant threat of molestation and abuse. Recent reports by the UN and other agencies indicate that Indian forces in Kashmir often target women to demoralize its people who are demanding an end to the Indian occupation. They don't only suffer from intense humiliation and harassment, but also undergo traumatic experiences with prolonged depression, making them mentally sick. Mr. President, the HRC can show its commitment to VDPA by pressurizing India to respect the human rights of Kashmiri people in general and Kashmiri women in particular. I thank you, Mr. President.
The next speaker is Village Uni.
وفقا لما أعلنه برنامج عمل فيينا يجب على المجتمع الدولي أن يكفل حقوق.
We have to underline the right to education. Mr. President, the human rights organizations, international and national, have monitored more than 4.5 million Yemeni children who were deprived of their education, and they have been subjected to a change of curriculum, and all this undermines the social fabric of the Yemeni society. There are more than 98 teachers have been killed, and more than 1,200 cases of kidnap, and they have ruined 1,700 schools. We appeal to the international community to stop all these violations practiced by the Houthi militias against our children in Yemen, and to abide by all these agreements and instruments. I thank you.
Next on the list is the World Muslim Congress.
Madam President, the World Council on Human Rights considers denial of rights recognition as a violation of human rights and underlines the importance of the effective realization of this right. The people of Jammu and Kashmir were promised this right by the UN Security Council. However, the denial of this right by Indian state has led to a regime of human rights violation. India used each and every tool to suppress the people's legitimate struggle for realization of their rights. It was due to the unjust and criminal silence on behalf of the UNSC and UNHRC. Indian government was encouraged to dismember occupied territory, take away its special status by revoking Article 370 and 35 of its own constitution, paving way for demographic change. The other policies adopted thereon are to make people of Indian occupied Kashmir jobless, homeless, and deny their identity and culture. These actions are illegal under international law against the spirits of Geneva Convention in contravention of the UN Resolution on Kashmir. Responding to the reports of OHCHR, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, VDM Institute, and other human rights organizations, Indian external minister said that we do not need external advices from self-appointed custodians. I wonder, is India here to distribute certificates to others? I urge this Council to make India accountable for defying its commitments and obligations and its worst human rights record in territory under its forced and illegal occupation. I thank you.
I now give the floor to the Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain.
Madam President, the implementation of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action calls for democracy, the respect of human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Yet democracy is only possible if people are allowed to freely express themselves and to fully participate in society. In Bahrain, citizens who want democracy are punished by the authorities. During the pro-democracy movement in 2011, the unelected ruler King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa called on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to march into Bahrain and implement a violent crackdown on Bahraini citizens. Thousands of protesters have been arrested and hundreds remain in prison today. These included individuals like human rights defender Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singas and Hassan Musayma, who were both sentenced to life in prison for leading these calls for democratic change. The Al Khalifa family is a brutal regime that would not have been able to maintain its iron grip without the intervention of Saudi and Emirati forces, as well as the unconditional security, military and economic support of the United States and United Kingdom. The Council should remind those countries to stop supporting perpetrators of human rights abuses in Bahrain. The international community must respect the needs and desires of Bahraini people to finally achieve democracy and self-determination. Thank you.
Next is the Community Human Rights and Advocacy Center.
Mr. President, the plight of women in conflict situations, especially in the territories under occupation, needs to be addressed by this Council. Mr. President, women living in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir are worst victims of violence by Indian armed forces. According to one estimate, there are about 3,000 half-widows, a unique name given to the Kashmiri women whose husbands have been arbitrarily arrested and disappeared up till now. They suffer from serious mental illness. Mass graves are outcome of these disappearances. In occupied Kashmir, there is not a single juvenile home for girls. They are kept in police lockups and prisons with adult criminals. Organized attacks on human rights defenders are carried out there by Indian state administration to silence voice of dissent. Excessive use of force is being used by Indian armed forces on peaceful protesters. Mr. President, my organization requests the Council to send a fact-finding mission to Indian-held Jammu and Kashmir to assess the human rights violations. I thank you, Mr. President.
The next speaker is Institut International pour le Droit et le Développement.
Mr. President, the continued discrimination and prosecution of peaceful protesters, activists, and journalists who are targeted by repressive regimes in silencing their voices. The world has witnessed the detention, torture, and sentencing of them. India has been cracking down and detaining protesters, activists, and journalists in the farmers' protests. The military coup in Myanmar cracked down on anti-coup protesters, killing a 20-year-old student. In a recent case in Iraqi Kurdistan, 5 journalists and activists have been sentenced to 6 years in prison for their participation in anti-government demonstrations against corruption. These are only just a few cases in recent months. Let's not forget, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. Once in its beginning stages presented hope and freedom of expression for millions of participants across the MENA region. However, leading to the most destructive consequences as authoritarian regimes suppressed and devastated their people and their countries. Let's not repeat the atrocities of the past and let history be a lesson for regimes to further the progress of expression, of freedom of expression, and the fundamental right to peacefully protest, so voices are heard loud and clear. We at Skyline International for Human Rights and IRDG call on the Council of Member States to support and condemn violations suppressing freedom of speech and the right to peacefully protest, and to commit to the protection of protesters, activists, and journalists. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Ingénieur du Monde.
Madam President, the Vienna Declaration guarantees the right to health. Today's greatest threat to public health is the coronavirus. In that regard, Israel's world-leading vaccination program is a model to be admired and emulated. Yet for some people, any good news about Israel is a problem. It disturbs their worldview and makes them angry. And so their reaction to the good news about Israel's vaccines was to twist it into something sinister. The canard that began to circulate was summarized by the comic TV news presenter on Saturday Night Live, who said, quote, Israel is reporting that they've vaccinated half their population, and I'm going to guess it's the Jewish half. This is exactly what many around the world now believe. Madam President, I am taking the floor today to state for the record, before the United Nations and before the world, that is a lie. The truth is that Israel's vaccination program has run in all Arab areas in Israel from day one. Out of a concern that not enough Israeli Arabs were coming to get vaccinated, Israel's Prime Minister visited Arab cities, speaking into the camera to say in Arabic, "Go and get vaccinated." The truth is that as of March 5th, 84% of Israel's Arab population over the age of 50 were vaccinated with at least one dose or recovered from the virus. The numbers by now will be even higher. Madam President, the truth is that there never was any ethnic or religious discrimination in Israel's vaccination program. The truth is the opposite. Israel's government actively campaigned to encourage Arab Israelis to get vaccinated. Thank you.
The next speaker is GeoExpertise Association.
Mr. President, as the COVID-19 pandemic began to spread in March 2020, European internal and external borders were increasingly locked and fortified, exacerbating the difficulties, risks and obstacles people on the move have already been facing to seek asylum in the EU. On February 23, in the North African enclave of Melilla, Spanish police have discovered 41 migrants hiding in trucks and waste containers in the hope of reaching the Spanish and European mainland. Some of them hid among broken glass bottles, and one man was found unconscious inside a plastic bag containing highly toxic ash. These people, concealed in extraordinarily dangerous places, violently remind to everyone the risks migrants are forced to endure in their desperate attempts to enter Europe. Euromed Rights Monitor and GeoExpertise recall the importance of providing safe and legal channels for asylum seekers to reach Europe, in order to reduce their need to resort to such tremendously unsafe methods. In 1993, the Vienna Declaration reaffirmed that everyone, without distinction of any kind, is entitled to the right to seek and enjoy asylum in other countries. Through limiting and denying access to people who leave their homes in search of a better life, Europe fails to uphold not only its international obligations, but also its core values: inclusion, justice, solidarity and non-discrimination. We thus call upon the EU and its member states to increase safe and legal pathways to Europe for people on the move, to ensure that they are protected and treated with dignity, and to guarantee them effective access to asylum procedures. Thank you.
The next speaker is ABC Tamil Oli.
Thank you, Chair. Tamil nation across the world is making campaign on their right to self-determination in accordance with the Vienna Declaration. The Internet with social media has become one of the most powerful instruments of the 21st century for increasing transparency, the conduct of the powerful, access to information, and for facilitating active citizenship participation in building democratic societies. But for Elam Tamils, the struggle and censure we are facing on our right to self-determination, we would like to bring your kind attention regarding the blocking of social media pages of Tamils like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and others. We have more than 120 million of Tamils living in India, Elam Tamil, and more than 90 countries across the world. We are direct witness of Tamil Elam's genocide during Mulai Vaikal. According to United Nations intern expert Charles Pitre report, there are more than 70,000 Tamils were killed in 2009 May during the final stage of the war. But we are talking of more than 147,000 people who are unaccounted between December 2008 and May 2009. Internet service providers and social media denied Tamil rights to inform on our genocide, and also on our history, denied the reconnaissance of 120 million of Tamils recognize our values and history. And unfortunately, for last 70 years, Tamil's history of resistance is totally denied, and the information are censored in all social medias, depriving to the access to the information to all Tamils across the world. We ask this council to protect the right of expression of peoples and their occupations on their right to self-determination. Thank you.
Next is Juventum EV.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Juventum is honored to participate. While VDPA still provides us with the skeleton of how to improve the situations, some of the original categorizations and discussions should be updated, reflecting the history of practice of the UN human rights mechanism. Human rights are universal, but the severities of different violations are not equal. The right to physical integrity should be cited more. This right can effectively bundle so many issues together and should supersede the taste rights, such as the freedom of religion or culture. Irreversible consequences should be taken more seriously in general. The industrial damages mentioned in paragraph 11 should be examined with honest science. Many disasters are man-made human rights violations that could have been prevented with precautionary principle. Empathy and compassion, armed with critical thinking and creativity, is the correct attitude of the human rights-based approach. A resolution should be written with the hints for practical measures. The minimum standards must be well defined and good practices should be compiled. Thank you very much for your attention.
I now give the floor to Sikh Human Rights Group.
The Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action was a groundbreaking achievement and game changer in human rights. Expectations were raised and hope in a better world was revived. Much has been achieved, but there are many issues that have also regressed. One of the key developments from that conference was to increase participation of civil society in human rights information gathering, policies, actions, and participation at the United Nations. While the number of organizations in consultative status has increased, there is a sense that the space for civil society participation has shrunk, with fewer and fewer opportunities for NGOs to express themselves in various forums or be able to access various offices. Human rights is about civil society. Human rights violations affect civil society. If the mechanisms for listening and interventions are not robust, civil society increasingly loses faith in the institutions that are meant to give it hope and support. We propose that agenda on the Vienna Declaration incorporate comprehensive audit on civil society participation at various levels, on how to increase it and make civil society interventions effective. It will be useful to know what civil society feels about progress by the United Nations and what the various organs have done to engage with civil society.
The next speaker is Association Central.
Thank you, Chair. The occupied territory of Tamil's homeland is in an urgent need of the implementation of the Vienna Declaration decisions for the sake of lasting peace in the island. Mr. President, the Ilam Tamil people and all international human rights organizations are demanding to be implemented in the occupied Ilam Tamil territory in the north and east of Sri Lanka, a territory which is nowadays illegally occupied by Sri Lankan military and in which the situation of human rights is deplorable. The Sri Lankan government does not only fail to implement the reaffirmations of the Declaration of Vienna, but also violates Geneva Convention and other applicable norms of humanitarian law mentioned in the World Human Rights Conference as well by committing constant grave human rights violations in the occupied Tamil's land pending decolonization. In May 2009, Sri Lankan military forces made a genocide war against Tamil by killing more than 146,000 people in a short period of 6 months from December 2008 to May 2009. Tamil people are still waiting for justice. For the last 7 decades, Ilam Tamils are living under Sinhala's occupation. At beginning, we used the Ahimsa way to obtain our freedom with Tandai Selva, Dilipan Anna, and Nei Pupati for 3 decades. We then resisted with armed force for 3 decades. But after Mulli Vaikal, it has been almost 12 years Tamils are waiting for the international community. Mr. President, we request the Human Rights Council to encourage Sri Lankan government to allow once and for all the Ilam Tamil people to exercise its inalienable rights to self-determination. Many thanks.
The next speaker is Association Bharati, Centre Culturel Franco-Tamil.
Thank you, Chair. The Tamils in Sri Lanka has suffered terrifically for the last 72 years under the Sinhalese government. We are requesting UNCHR and the UN to give us justice and assure our protection. The Sri Lankan unitary state create the 6th Amendment to oppress the Tamils' rights of self-determination is totally against the principle of Vienna Declaration. They hastily passed the 6th Amendment in 1983 to stifle the voice of Tamil. The amendment's important sections are Article 157, no political party or other association or organization shall have one of its objective or aim in the establishment of separate state within the territory of Sri Lanka. No person shall directly or indirectly or outside Sri Lanka support, promote, finance, encourage the establishment of separate state within the territory of Sri Lanka, which found guilty could stripe his or her civic rights, etc. The 6th Amendment is therefore draconian in effect. It is extend its arm to crack down on free speech, even advocate outside Sri Lanka, whether they are a citizen or not, foreign official or organization who dare to support the cause of separate Tamil state are not immune. The 6th Amendment is totally against the preamble of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article UN Common and Political Rights. civil rights. Request this Council to recognize the Tamil rights to self-determination, help us to have the referendum, to refer the Sri Lanka to ICC, to name the country's specific Tappator Sri Lanka. Thank you.
The next speaker is Society for Development and Community Empowerment.
Thank you, Chair. Ulam Tamils in the island of Sri Lanka have our right to self-determination according to Vienna Declaration. Tamils are victims from United Kingdom colonization, and United Kingdom failed on its decolonization process. The territorial integrity of Northeast has been systematically violated by the Sri Lankan state and its judiciary mechanism. As a result, we are forced into Northern Provincial Council and Eastern Provincial Council against our own will, and both are fully occupied by the Sri Lankan military. All human rights violations in the island affecting Tamils are caused by the main violation of the Sri Lankan state to not respect Tamils' right to self-determination. As all rights for the Ulam Tamils are violations by the Sri Lankan state system from this main violation. I urge this assembly to investigate the main violation of genocide against Tamils. I call upon the members of Human Rights Council to investigate the calling at the earlier possible session of a panel discussion on the implementation of the right to self-determination in the field of economic, social, cultural, civil and political rights. I humbly request to the General Assembly's Special Committee on the Decolonization to have a special session with Ulam Tamils on our political aspiration. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Tournai Lepage.
Thank you, Mr. President. According to the Vienna Declaration, all people have the right of self-determination. But the Ulam Tamils of Sri Lanka have been categorically denied their right to self-determination. We are disappointed. The Council refused to acknowledge the grave situation and ongoing ethnic cleansing against the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The recent intimidation of 2,000 Tamils during the Pothuvill to Polikandi march is further proof that Tamil people can't even express their concern through the democratic process and don't have a freedom of assembly in Sri Lanka. Mr. President, this pandemic has pushed nation and world leaders to show compassion and respect for one another. But the Sri Lankan Sinhalese chauvinistic government continue its racial discrimination and violence in full view of the world the personal freedom and the right of Ulam Tamils of the North and East. We demand the international community to take the necessary action to preserve the Tamil people from extermination in Sri Lanka. We humbly request this Council to refer Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court and name a country special rapporteur for Sri Lanka. Thank you.
The next speaker is Association Culturelle des Tamouls en France.
Thank you, Chair. Ulam Tamils of northeast Sri Lanka have been categorically denied their rights to self-determination by the Sri Lankan occupied government in their native lands. We regret that the Council has refused to acknowledge ongoing discrimination and ethnic cleansing of Tamils in Sri Lanka and the need for a referendum for their freedom. Just a few weeks ago, there was a Pothuvill to Polikandi march in which over 100,000 Tamils participated, despite the threat of arrest and imprisonment. P2P demonstrators mobilized demands for the United Nations and international community to act against the injustices perpetrated against Ulam Tamils in Sri Lanka and for their rights to self-determination. Sri Lankan security forces have been intimidating and collecting statements from Tamil MPs, human rights defenders, local councillors, activists, families of enforced disappearances, internet users, and journalists across Northeast who took part in Pothuvill to Polikandi march. The issue of racial discrimination in all its aspects is prevalent due to the control and influence of the Sinhalese government upon Tamils who are a nation both ethnically and religiously different. This violation exists in full view of the modern world that believe in personal freedoms and the right to self-determination of Ulam Tamils. We call on the Council members to recognize the Tamils' right to self-determination. We request to this Council to refer Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court. And we also request to name a country-specific rapporteur for Sri Lanka. Thank you.
The next speaker is World Barua Organization.
Madam President, VDPA emphasizes that democracy, development and human rights are interdependent. Unfortunately, member states like India have forgotten this principle. Government of India is pushing for privatization at the cost of farmers, oppressed community and minorities. It is using undemocratic methods to silence the voice of dissent. For example, to suppress huge but the peaceful ongoing protest of farmers, tear gas and water cannons were used even against senior citizens and women protesters. False cases are instigated against protesters. Same methodology was used for suppressing a protest against Citizen Amendment Act. Myself, Chandrasekhar Azad, founder of Bhim Army and national president of Azad Samaj Party, request the Council on behalf of WBO to urge India to uphold human rights of the peaceful, non-violent protesting farmers and stop imposing draconian or unconstitutional law on its citizens. Thank you.
The next speaker is Sociedade Maranhense de Direitos Humanos.
Señor Presidente, nosotros, organizaciones diversas de la sociedad civil brasileña, hacemos un llamado a las personas y los gobiernos
to help us. The Brazilian population is not being protected by the government, and we are paying with our lives. The government is propagating the violence, not protecting the people. We will soon reach 300,000 deaths, and we'll have averages of about 2,000 deaths. Human rights are being attacked, and the policies are actually being destroyed by the government itself. It's absolutely acceptable that human rights are being violated. Brazil was one of the first countries in the world to have a national human rights program in 1996. We're now in the third version of this, but the current government does not want to revise this. There's been no publicity, no respect for the main achievements of Vienna. This is acting against the principles of non-discrimination, namely the whole issue of universality, invisibility and interdependence of human rights. We'd call on the UN to open up investigation on the Brazilian government's actions during the pandemic and everything that they are doing which is flying in the face of Vienna. Many thanks.
The next speaker is Liberation.
Madam President, Article 19 of Vienna Declaration declares that the person belonging to minorities have the right to enjoy their own culture and practice their own religion. All over the world, there are examples of minorities being prohibited from following their own culture, religion, and practice their own faiths. However, in some cases, state is supporting non-state majoritarian actors in exploiting and suppressing minorities. For instance, in India, while majority groups are imposing their ideals and culture on Dalit and indigenous people, the state is not just silent but also active in imposing majority values, ideals and culture affecting the minorities. Imposition of Citizenship Amendment Act affecting indigenous people from northeast regions, imposing ban on beef, imposing ban on religion convergence, etc. are some example of government regressive policies. So we ask this council to communicate with India the need to remain neutral as a state and protect and promote liberty of all its citizens. Thank you.
Next on the list is Integrated Youth Empowerment Common Initiative Group.
Madam President, my organization would like to share the grave issue of statelessness and change of demography that is being orchestrated in India under the highly controversial Citizenship Amendment Act. Thousands of All Assam Students' Union protesters took out a rally in the city of Tezpur in India, expressing their concerns against the law that promises citizenship to non-Muslim immigrants from 3 neighboring countries of India if they came in before 2015. Madam President, the CAA has faced even more resistance in the northeastern states of India, where many fear it would legalize illegal settlers from Bangladesh. The drastic changes of demography in India have left millions of native or tribal people insecure. The Indian police resorted to baton charge on protesters of All Assam Students' Union who took out a rally in Tezpur to protest the Indian government's controversial citizenship law. The peasant native leader Akhil Gogoi was arrested by India for demanding his lawful right to peaceful protests. The native people of Assam have strongly condemned the Indian police crackdown and demanded revocation of this discriminatory law imposed by India. Therefore, we request the global community and the UNHRC that India must be stopped from changing the demography in the northeastern 7 states. Thank you.
The next speaker is Organisation Internationale pour les pays les moins avancés.
Madam President, Article 2 of Vienna Declaration stated that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status. In Yemen, the people of the south have been calling for Human Rights Council to support their right in restoring their independent state since 1994. For that reason, we recommend the Council the following key solutions. First, the Council should put pressure to stop the northern armed aggression against the south by identifying the warlords among the Houthis and the Islah Party and refer them to the ICC in order to stop the conflict, eliminate extremism and eradicate terrorism. Second, the Council should take effective measures to eliminate the root causes of the conflict between the South and North and to support the SPC in its talks with the UN Special Envoy to Yemen. 3. The Council should acknowledge the failed unification agreement and push the Secretary General to establish a framework of restoration for 2 former states. Thus, the promotion of human rights and conflict prevention, post-conflict peace building will only be achieved if these recommendations are taken into consideration. Thank you, Madam President.
The next speaker is Global Welfare Association.
Madam President, freedom of religion and peaceful enjoyment of their religious practices has become a dangerous affair in India. The members of minorities lose their lives at the hands of Hindu extremists, and the Indian state appears to be helpless in the face of such blatant violations of human rights. The situation in India is very sensitive right now. Many Christians in India are facing grave situations. The Indian government is clamping down on the churches and passing new laws to incite hatred and anger against Christians in India. It seems that the radical Hindus feel threatened by the Indian Christians, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to be a Christian in India. India is ranked 10th on Open Doors USA World Watch list of 50 countries where it is most difficult to be a Christian believer. The organization notes that Hindu extremists believe that all Indians should be Hindus and the country should be rid of Christianity and Islam. As a result, Christians accused of following a foreign faith are often physically attacked and sometimes killed, as well as under constant pressure from their family and community. Therefore, I request this Council to ensure that India fulfill its obligation towards protection of minorities in India. Thank you.
Next is the Center for Africa Development and Progress.
Thank you, Chair. The Vienna Declaration states that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. The international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner on the same footing and with the same emphasis. In this context, we want to highlight the plight of the fishermen from Tamil Nadu who are time and again killed by the Sri Lankan Navy. On January 18th, 4 fishermen from Pudukkottai were tortured and beaten to death by the Sri Lankan Navy. Thousands of families are dependent on fishing for a livelihood and come from very poor economic backgrounds. Fishermen from Tamil Nadu have continuously faced harassments at the hands of the Sri Lankan Navy and have been forced to quit the profession and take up menial jobs fearing Sri Lankan naval attacks. There are no defined maritime boundary lines between India and Sri Lanka, and fishing takes place mostly during the nights. It is difficult for the fishermen to remain in their respective territorial waters. There are credible allegations by local fishermen organizations that the Sri Lankan Navy has killed more than 800 fishermen, which is a gross violation of the basic right to life. Hence, we request the High Commissioner to raise this important issue with the government of Sri Lanka and urge them to stop future occurrences and adequately compensate the fishermen from Tamil Nadu. Thank you.
The next speaker is Association des étudiants tamouls de France.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Vienna Declaration underscores the universal principles of equality and non-discrimination. In May 2009, Sri Lankan military forces made a genocide war against Tamil by killing more than 146,000 people. P2P movement, which recently led a 5-day march joined by tens of thousands of Tamils, have urged the Council to help to refer the Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide committed against the Tamil people by the Sri Lankan state and the Tamils' rights to self-determination. The resolution proposes has failed to include international mechanism and the political aspirations of the Tamil people. The current Sri Lankan government went one step further and officially withdrew from the co-sponsorship of the resolutions 30/1, 34/1 and 40/1 and walked away from the UNHRC accountability process. We appeal to you to take our request seriously and include referral to ICC in the draft resolution. Thank you.
The next speaker is Alliance Creative Community Project.
This statement is made in collaboration with the Tamil National People's Front. The VDPA recognizes the right of peoples to take any legitimate action to realize their inalienable right of self-determination. The Tamil nation in Sri Lanka has been struggling to realize its right to self-determination in the face of structural genocide committed by the Sri Lankan state. When the state turned violent, the Tamils took to armed resistance. In 2002, a ceasefire was agreed upon by the Sri Lankan state and the Tamil Liberation Movement, the LTTE. This was primarily due to a strategic parity having been created on the battlefield, with almost 75% of the Tamil homeland coming under the complete writ of the LTTE. It was expected that the ground realities would lead to a negotiated settlement that would recognize the Elam Tamil nation and its distinct sovereignty, albeit within a completely restructured federal state. Thus, the hope was that the right to self-determination of the Tamil nation would finally be realized. What happened was something else. The government, with many of its international backers, chose a military solution instead, a course of action that has resulted in the Tamil people accusing the Sri Lankan state of having committed genocide. For as long as the UN and this council treats the right to self-determination with mere tokenism, those who truly struggle to realize this inalienable right will continue to be victims. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Le Pont.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La déclaration de Vienne annonce que les populations sous domination coloniale.
Thank you. All legitimate measures have to be taken according to the UN Charter to ensure that they have a right to self-determination. It's very important that we address the violations of human rights. There have been the military occupation after more than 70 years of oppression. The whole issue of racial discrimination and structural genocide of the Tamils are very current. The Sri Lankan forces are continuing to carry out unbearable suffering. They are different from the Sinhalese, and our current situation has to do with the UK colonization. Tamils are a victim of structural genocide for the last 70 years. We would ask the UK government and the international community to recognize the right of self-determination for Tamils within the General Assembly, that this should be declared the 18th autonomous territory, and that should be put on the agenda. and that there is a hearing with the Tamil representatives. The international community has to take the necessary measures to preserve the ethnic identity of Tamils and ensure they are not wiped out, as well as recognize the self-determination for Tamil people. Thank you.
This was the last speaker on my list, and with this last intervention, we have concluded the general debate on item 8. Before continuing this meeting, we will have a technical pause of 5 minutes. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we now resume our meeting, and I understand that certain delegations have requested to exercise the right of reply under agenda item 8. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Armenia. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation asked for the floor for the right of reply to Azerbaijan. At the outset, we would like to reiterate once again that at all stages of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Armenia has been in favor of the exclusively peaceful settlement, and we will continue to strive for a just, durable, and dignified peace. There is a stark contrast between statements and state-induced Armenophobia in Azerbaijan, where internet is regularly shut down, human rights defenders and journalists are being tortured, jailed, abducted from the territories of third countries, and occasionally killed, where rallies are only allowed if an enraged crowd calls for death to Armenians. We'd like to bring to attention of the Council just a few examples of the last 10 days. On March 8th, on International Women's Day, the rally with the calls to end femicide and violence against women in Azerbaijan was brutally suppressed by extensive use of force. Freedom House stated in this regard, and I quote, "For the third year in a row, Azerbaijani authorities have cracked down on International Women's Day march, rejecting the organizers' permit application, detaining activists, and shutting down public transportation in a brazen violation of freedom of assembly." End of quote. There are credible reports on government-led spear campaign against women's rights defenders, in particular through publication of private content. Videotaping of apartments and hotel rooms of human rights activists and journalists with further blackmail and then broadcasting is one of the most widely used and utterly shocking tactics in this country for the last decades. In the most recent incident, Azerbaijani blogger in exile, Mohammad Mirzali, who runs a video blog and criticizes Azerbaijani authorities, has been blackmailed with a video that was made in the house of his sister. According to the report by the Committee to Protect Journalists, several days ago, Mirzali was stabbed and severely injured by 6 attackers who also attempted to cut out his tongue. As to the provisions of November 9 statement, we would like to remind Azerbaijan about Armenian prisoners of war and detainees. The European Court of Human Rights issued a final notice to Azerbaijan with request to provide information on their fate and whereabouts. Most recently, court has decided to notify the Committee of Ministers of Council of Europe on the subject, noting that Azerbaijan has failed to respect time limits set by the court. And currently, there are 188 active interim measures applied against Azerbaijan with respect to Armenian captives. Non-implementation of interim measures amounts to violation of international legally binding obligations of Azerbaijan. I thank you.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil to exercise his rights of reply. You have 3 minutes. Do we have Brazil? Brazil has the floor. We'll move to the next speaker, as I understand that there is a problem with the Brazilian statement. The next speaker to exercise the right of reply is Morocco, for 3 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Vice President. We've always tried to show a constructive spirit. We want to avoid politicization of debate. We hadn't intended to exercise right of reply, but now we need to refute what was said by the Algerian ambassador, showing manipulation of facts. It's difficult to understand his allegations. I think the sound is extremely bad, the interpreters would point out, but these are fallacious and ill-informed allegations. These are attacks against Morocco. It's a biased approach as well. It's very important that we recall that this country is in flagrant contradiction, bearing in mind what was said in 2001 and the proposals regarding the concerned provinces. Morocco is trying to be serene and calm. We've always opted for a constructive approach, a diplomatic approach, respecting international legality. When it comes to the southern provinces, Morocco has seen that this has become a socio-economic development hub. This is something to the benefit of the region. This development, I think, is the clearest expression of what our policies have achieved, socially, economically, and culturally. And the people themselves are able to benefit from the fruits of this development. I would add that the Southern Sahara provinces are stable, normal situation, and very often standards of living are better than that in the country attacking us. I think it's extremely important that Algeria looks at what's in its own country. And we need to bear in mind what was said by some NGOs in this session. And I think that's what they should be doing rather than unproductively fixating on my country. The interpreter obliged, we had no statement and the sound was very bad.
I invite Brazil to exercise its right of reply for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, the delegation wishes to exercise its right of reply to comments made by civil society. The right to health is a human right enshrined in the Brazilian Constitution. This constitutional obligation also plays a fundamental role in the way we orient our responses to the pandemic. In 2020, the priority was to adopt all necessary prophylactic measures to fight the pandemic while ensuring that families would maintain a minimum of dignity and income, including minorities and vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and communities of people of African descent known as quilombolas. An emergency aid was approved early on in the order of 106 billion American dollars to ensure the living standards of 68 million people through a cash transfer system. As the protection of human rights, the promotion of public security is a key priority for the Brazilian government. Public security is in itself a social right, which is essential for the full enjoyment of other human rights. Violence and insecurity are major concerns for the population of many countries, including Brazil. The Brazilian government is examining and taking necessary measures to strengthen the fight against crime, reduce insecurity, protect the population, and promote development. We acknowledge the challenge of violence affecting people of African descent. To tackle such problems, the government is focusing on preventive actions to reduce the vulnerability of Black youths in Brazil, comprising measures of social inclusion, as well as awareness raising among public officials within the criminal justice system, as well as policy forces. Recent decisions related to firearms, regulation, or gun control are not yet in force and are still under the examination of the Supreme Court. It's an ongoing debate that involves all branches of power in accordance with democratic values. The debate of views and different perspectives is a common and healthy practice in any democracy. It is therefore too soon to prejudge any outcome. Regarding the review of the Third National Plan on Human Rights issued in 2009, the Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights is currently defining the methodology for the plan review, which is a legal obligation to be fulfilled by the government in order to assess implemented policies and propose new ones if necessary. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to China to exercise its right of reply for 3 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, some NGOs have abused the platform of the Council and made unreasonable accusations against China by distorting facts. China strongly opposes and categorically rejects them. Xinjiang is not an issue of human rights. At present, Xinjiang enjoys social stability, economic growth, national unity, religious harmony, cultural development, improved livelihood. People of all ethnicities there enjoy extensive rights and freedoms. The door to Xinjiang remains open as always. We welcome the upcoming visit of the High Commissioner there. Both sides are in contact on the visit. However, the purpose of the visit should be promoting exchanges and cooperation rather than the so-called investigation based on presumption of guilt. We strongly oppose any attempt to use this for political manipulation and for pressuring China. In the face of the sudden outbreak of COVID-19, China has given paramount importance to people and to life, and has put the safety and health of everyone first. It has done utmost to safeguard the value and dignity of life. In the face of this unknown novel coronavirus, China conducted epidemiological investigation of this unknown pneumonia as soon as it appeared, and it identified its pathogen immediately and shared with the world and all countries viral gene sequencing immediately. Experts of WHO who went to China agreed unanimously that China's measures were timely and effective, and they have prevented the spread of epidemic in China. What's more, it has gained time for the whole world. This is the basic fact. Some NGOs have fabricated lies vilifying China. Their attempts will never succeed. China urges NGOs concerned to stop abusing the platform of this council to making lies and vilifying China. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I now give the floor to Azerbaijan for the right of reply. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We took this floor in order to exercise our right of reply to the right of reply of the delegation of Armenia. Firstly, Armenia's side claims that it was always committed to the peaceful resolution of the conflict. One cannot call the peaceful attitude the innumerable attacks by Armenia to our civilians during the occupation period, nor attacks organized in July in state border area between Azerbaijan and Armenia were in line with the peaceful statement that made by Armenia here. It was also Armenia who abused numerously and violated the ceasefire agreements issued during the latest conflict in the October. Therefore, we should remind the Armenian delegate that the trilateral statement signed on November 10, also by the Prime Minister of Armenia, has brought an end to the 30-year-long occupation by Armenia of the internationally recognized territories of Azerbaijan, and has restored historical justice in our region. We should also recommend to Armenia to look into its own internal affairs, where the opposition members, journalists, and people trying to exercise their right of freedom are attacked and jailed on a daily basis. Armenia should also look into its own ethnic hatred policy that is a state-level policy for a long time. During its last phase of aggression against our country, similar to its methods of warfare employed in early 1990s, Armenia, with the direct participation of mercenaries and foreign terrorist fighters, again mobilized all its skills to murder civilians and cause indiscriminate or disproportionate harm to cities, towns, and villages of Azerbaijan. The armed forces of Armenia have repeatedly used the prohibited cluster munitions and white phosphorus projectiles in their attacks against the densely populated areas of our country. Mr. Vice President, the ethnic hatred pursued by Armenia showed itself in particular when returning the occupied territories to their true owners, to the Azerbaijanis, in accordance with the trilateral statement. At that time, the villages and the cultural objects were burned and destroyed in order to leave nothing to their true owners. Even the trees were cut down, all the material objects and cultural property belonging to Azerbaijanis were stolen by Armenia. While giving back the territories to their legal owners, Armenia has heavily mined that places, being motivated by ethnic hatred in order to kill civilian Azerbaijani IDPs when they return to their places of origin. Furthermore, during the time of the occupation, all monuments, in particular Islamic ones, were vandalized in our occupied territories by Armenia. Thus, all 67 mosques were destroyed by Armenia and left unusable. In addition, about 900 Muslim graveyards and tombs.
I thank you, but I would ask you to conclude since you have exceeded your time. Thank you. Maintenant, je donne la parole au distingué.
I now give the floor to Algeria to exercise their right to reply for 3 minutes. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. For 4 decades, the Kingdom of Morocco, whom we have known in Algeria with respect to Western Sahara and in international fora, has been mobilizing all its resources to render international opinion in a position to impose a blackout on the question of promoting its detestable propaganda, according to which the terror that is used for colonization would go against the Sahrawi people. We have heard a few examples of this. As Morocco joined the club of colonizers who consider that this was a positive part of history. But let us not be distracted. The enterprises who spread the sentiments and the representatives of the Western Sahara, the Polisario Front, have been led to theft, to rape, to pillaging of natural resources. They're complicit of the crimes of colonization, far more serious than this. I would like to thank the Kingdom of Morocco to give me the opportunity to underscore that these companies have been working fully aware of the status of Western Sahara. This is not charity work, it is premeditated efforts, and it should lead to the payment of reparations to the people of Western Sahara. There are those who have been denied their rights. In 1975, there were rulings from the international courts, and later in 2016 and 2018 also it was stated by international instances that this is a separate territory to the Kingdom of Morocco. This leaves the situation completely clear. There are those, however, who would defend the colonizers, the oppressors, in their political repressive methodology. Thank you.
I understand that the distinguished representative of Armenia has requested a second right of reply. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We have to remind to the delegation of Azerbaijan that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, its causes and consequences, is the most vivid example of outright denial of the basic human rights. Peace is never built by multiplying impunity. Peace cannot be built on the ruins of justice. 4 days ago, the president of Azerbaijan declared that he will erase Armenian inscriptions from the ancient Armenian churches because he believes they are fake. In its Orwellian reality, Azerbaijan believes that it can change history by the wish of authorities. Azerbaijan is convinced that its crimes will be left unpunished. A country that has been in the center of basically all international corruption-related scandals of the last decade by breeding and exporting corruption, a country that undermined values, laws, and institutions, is convinced that aggressive militarism, terror, threats, and impunity will make their way. Facing huge magnitude of human rights-related criticism, Azerbaijan fails to make use of human rights instruments to reverse its dire record on gross violations. Instead, it tries to shift the attention to the conflict-related matters to conceal its unapologetic crackdown on human rights and fundamental freedoms. Vice President, the earliest just settlement of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is an immediate imperative for all who are interested in turning the South Caucasus into a peaceful, stable, and prosperous region. No durable solution is possible at the expense of fundamental human rights of the indigenous Armenian population of Artsakh. I thank you.
It was brought to my attention that the distinguished representative of Ukraine has asked the floor to exercise his first right of reply under agenda item 8. You have the floor for 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm taking the floor with regard to today's statement by the Russian delegation. We strongly reject the participation of today's meeting the representative of the Russian occupying power in the temporary occupied Crimea. In this regard, I wish to recall for the Russian delegation the United Nations General Assembly resolutions 68/262, territorial integrity of Ukraine, 73/194, 74/17, 75/29, the program of militarization of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the state of Sevastopol, Ukraine, as well as part of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. The resolution 71/205, 72/190, 73/263, 74/168, as well as 75/192, situation of human rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the state of Sevastopol, Ukraine. With regard to the crocodile tears on the water supplies, I wish to stress that under the international humanitarian law, the occupying power bears full responsibility for the temporary occupied territories, which are under its effective control. In this regard, I would like to remind Article 55 and Article 60 of the 4th Geneva Convention, Convention for the Protection of Civilians, Persons in Time of War of 12 August 1949, which states that the occupying power is obliged to provide the civilian population of the occupied territory with the necessary resources, supplies, and materials, including water. Therefore, Russia, as an occupying power, bears full responsibility to ensure adequate water supply to the population of the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the state of Sevastopol. We point out the fact that the Russian occupation authorities in Crimea try to mask under humanitarian need a shortage of water supply for accelerated development of military facilities and enterprises of military-industrial complex. It is evident that the need in water resources is growing against the background of peninsular colonization, rapid population growth within targeted policy of changing Crimea's demographic composition. Such actions by an occupying power constitute a war crime. This purpose is to populate Ukraine territories with Russian citizens loyal to the state's expansionist policy and thus to consolidate the illegal occupation. Speculations around the humanitarian crisis are nothing more than another attempt to misportray the situation by Russian propaganda machinery. Instead of delivering false accusations, the Russian Federation, as it has been repeatedly reminded by the OSCHR and the UN Secretary General in his reports on Crimea, should implement the mentioned UNGA resolution and provide unimpeded access to the temporarily occupied territories for the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. It is time for the Russian Federation, as a member of Human Rights Council, to stop
Thank you,
violating
Madam. I have to
human rights
request you to conclude your statement. Thank you.
I thank you.
Je comprends que le distingué représentant du Maroc.
The distinguished representative from Morocco, I believe, has requested the floor again for a second right to reply. You have the floor.
Pour 2 minutes.
For 2 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. Je m'excuse de prendre.
Vice President, sorry to take the floor again, but I just wanted to denounce the behavior of the representative of Algeria. These are unproductive remarks, and they've got nothing to do with the agenda and our discussions. These discussions lead nowhere. But they show that Algeria wishes to manipulate this council for its own benefit. And we felt it was important to state that. Morocco exercises its sovereignty over the 7 provinces. That is not changing. Despite the aggressiveness and aggressive words of the ambassador of Algeria, as everybody knows, and I think many people are aware of. This is a country shot through with corruption, and we're seeing this irresponsible and manipulatory attitude. Thank you, Chair.
Merci. I understand that the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan has requested to exercise his second right of reply. You have the floor, sir, for 2 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, we are exercising our second right of reply in response to the right of reply made by Armenia. As a member of this Council, Armenia should not abuse this platform dedicated to the promotion and protection of human rights. Armenia had been violating the fundamental human rights of Azerbaijani IDPs, such as the right to property and the right to return for almost 3 decades. As it was said before, during the occupation, Armenia destroyed homes and properties of Azerbaijani IDPs. The initial examination of the liberated territories of Azerbaijan shows that the towns and villages have been totally destroyed by Armenia. Most importantly, the massive mining of those territories by Armenia prevents the return of Azerbaijani IDPs to their former places of origin. During the time of armed hostilities, Armenia disregarded its obligations under IHL and carried out military attacks against civilians. And now, after the cessation of hostilities, continues to kill and seriously injure Azerbaijani civilians by the mines it has placed, which is indiscriminatory in its very nature and cause unnecessary suffering and injury. Mr. Vice President, the issue of massive contamination of mines in the liberated territories of our country is the most urgent issue now, and it should be addressed properly in order to bring Armenia into account. Thank you very much.
Maintenant, je donne la parole au distingué représentant permanent de...
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the delegation of Algeria for a second right to reply for 2 minutes. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. In my first right to reply, I mentioned that the Kingdom of Morocco, through all possible means, is attempting to impose a blackout in regional and United Nations agencies on the question of decolonization of Western Sahara. We have seen the proof of this, and again, testimony towards this a few minutes ago. I would like to call on the Honourable Plenipotentiary of that country to note that the 2 treaties in the first article talk about the right to self-determination, the right to self-determination. We are in a body of human rights, and it is fully legitimate that we should raise the question of the failure to end the process of decolonization. This is not just a legitimate issue, but a relevant and pertinent one. We must bring to account a colonizer who illegally occupies a territory and demand explanations on the daily abuses and violence committed there. According to the United Nations, this is a non-autonomous region. That is to say that it is up to the United Nations organization and of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to follow up on this issue in this territory and investigate the abuses and any violence in that area. I would like to leave in silence the words about the phenomenon that we have seen in their own country, I would not speak of the 25% of the national income which comes from illicit products, specifically illegal substances. Thank you, Mr. President.
This was the last speaker on my list. Are there any other delegations wishing to exercise the right of reply under agenda item 8? I understand this is not the case. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with this last intervention we have concluded the consideration of agenda